for quite some time now. You might drive around, as we have, through the various neighborhoods in town and see, you'll see a lot of really nice and well-kept buildings and houses and businesses. And you'll see some that are run down. And every once in a while, you see one that is a little bit more run down than the others. Most to the point where it's dilapidated and potentially falling down on its last legs, almost to the point where you could say that it has been demolished through neglect. And the board thought that this is an issue, particularly in our historic districts, that needed to be addressed. It really kind of reached its peak in recent years with the Carey building. Some folks remember it as Fowler's or the Z's building. And oh, CJ's now in the, okay. And that's a really historic building that had a lot of important history to the town. But through years of neglect by its previous out-of-state owner, it fell into such disrepair that the city had to step in. The city was looking for a spot for its municipal courthouse at the time, but the city ended up having to step in, buy the building, mitigate it, and demolish it. And that resulted in the creation of the municipal courthouse, which will most assuredly last for another 100 years and develop a lot of historic significance in its own right. But it did result in the loss of a really important historic building and a real loss to the historic fabric of downtown Cheyenne. So the purpose of our proposed ordinance is to save these historic buildings from gradual deterioration, to ensure that a certain level of minimum maintenance is kept on these buildings in a just, equitable, and practical way. And really what that does is it not only serves to protect our historic buildings and our historic fabric, but it also protects the health and safety of people in Cheyenne. You don't have a building that's about ready to fall down on somebody. It also helps with adjacent property owners' home values. Everybody knows that you always have that one building that's run down, and it may hurt the value of your house when it comes time for you to sell it. There's a lot of facets to demolition by neglect that go beyond simple preservation, but preservation is our mission, and that is the intent for why we proposed this ordinance. CJ, you don't have your camera on, CJ.
There we go.
There you go.
Sorry, everyone, I was having some technical difficulties there.
No worries. So CJ Young, as I mentioned, is our vice chair. He is also a downtown business owner, and he has a couple of remarks and I guess views that are pertinent that at this time I'm going to turn the floor over to him to talk about. CJ.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Again, my apologies for running a little late today. But I did want to share three kind of main points about the ordinance that in regards to it. The first one being, as Jason kind of mentioned in the introduction, what's the need for it? He kind of talked about that genesis. And as a downtown business owner, I really look at it from a practical sense of where do people want to spend time, right? Where are the communities that are doing well with their downtown environments? And I think a common feature that you see is downtowns that have well-kept, beautiful historic buildings. Think of Fort Collins, think of downtown Jackson Hole, think of Larimer Plaza or 16th Street in Denver, all locations that have worked hard to preserve those historic structures. And as a result, they're now areas that people want to go visit, they want to spend time. And that ties directly into being a business owner downtown. I own a store right downtown between 17th and 18th. And I can tell you, there is a certain desire, I think, among folks to want to shop in a nice environment. I don't even think it's that veiled, right? People want to be in a cool area. And one of those things that's really neat and unique to towns we have in our area are those beautiful downtowns, that those beautiful buildings that are a part of our heritage and our history. And is a business owner, that's where people want to go and shop, right? They want to shop and visit multiple places. They want to go to restaurants. They want to go to stores in buildings that are well kept. If you have something that's falling apart in your neighborhood, I think that's a detriment to people window shopping or even feeling comfortable in your downtown. So that is something of one of the main reasons that I support it, not just in my role on the board, but also as a business owner. And I really think that if we can continually improve Cheyenne's downtown, as we've done already, many great people before us, and continue to work to improve it, it's a place where hopefully people are going to want to come and spend time other than just on Frontier Days. So I think that's really something we need to focus on. And I think the last point I really wanted to make is this is not about taking away anyone's property rights. This is not about taking away your property right as an owner, really. It's about having a duty to your property by living in a community. Same as shoveling the sidewalks or not disassembling a car and leaving it on the road. There are certain things that when living in the city and in a community that we want to take care of and make sure that we don't have these kind of problems in our town. And I think those decaying buildings are one of them. When a building is starting to fall apart, it's a health hazard, it's an eyesore, it brings down property values in the area. There's many issues with them. We have homeless and vagrancy issues in downtown Cheyenne. I can assure you that as a business owner, I've dealt with that on many occasions. And so if we can work to protect these buildings without taking away people's property rights, I really want to emphasize that because I'm a big believer and supporter in personal property rights. And I think that really what we're going for here is not to drop the hammer on someone who can't afford to fix a building or has fallen on hard times. This is for people that are have willful negligence, that are just could fix it, could take care of it, but don't. And I think that's really what we want to emphasize. If someone needs help or needs us to work with them on taking care of their building, that's something we want to do. And those are kind of my main thoughts on this. So with that, I'd, unless Chairman Bogsty has anything else he'd like to add, I think we could turn it over to Committee Member Simpson, and I think he could elaborate a little more about the depth of the bill and how it works in a practical sense.
Thank you, CJ. Millward, go ahead. Millward, you're muted.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, CJ and Millward Simpson, Secretary, Cheyenne Historic Preservation Board, and longtime resident of Cheyenne, and multiple generation resident of our wonderful state. So, what is this ordinance intended to do, and what is it intended to apply to, and how does it work? So what does it do? Well, this ordinance would add a new section called Demolition by Neglect to Title 15 in the City Code. That's the Buildings and Construction section of the City Code. The ordinance is designed, as has been mentioned, to prevent situations where historic structures become neglected to the point that what you have is a state of disrepair that really constitutes a de facto demolition. And the way it does this is it establishes a historic property owner's duty to maintain and duty to repair their buildings. It also addresses the public safety issues that can arise when buildings deteriorate to this state where it's a de facto demolition. And it provides an equitable, just, and practicable method to address the issue for the property owner and the city. So what does it apply to? And we have a slide up right now, or Sam, if you could bring that back up. So it applies to these contributing structures. These are structures that contribute to the historic districts and historic character of Cheyenne. And there's kind of the criteria for a contributing structure. And this is based on the criteria in the National Historic Preservation Act. It has to meet at least one of these associated with, the building has to be associated with events or persons that are significant to Cheyenne's history. So to be a contributing structure, it needs to be a building that actually has some significance to our history that can be identified. Number two, another criteria that it has to meet, embody the distinctive characteristics of the period of significance. So you have like the Rainsford District, Historic District, or the Capital North District. And there will be kind of a period of significance for those buildings. Maybe it's the Cattle Baron era of our city that was so significant. So that's another possible criteria. And then on the National Register of Historic Places, the kind of standard benchmark is a building has to be at least 50 years old. So those are the things that help define what a contributing structure is. And can we put up again, Sam, that previous slide? We know that there are 1,300 plus contributing structures in the city. And here's kind of an aerial view. 2 of those are city owned. And all of those contributing structures are subject to this proposed ordinance. So there's kind of what it would apply to. And the ordinance lists the kinds of structural defects that need to be addressed to prevent a determination of demolition by neglect. And here's kind of an example of those. And here's how we would kind of determine that there might be an instance of demolition by neglect happening. So you have kind of a listing there of the type of deterioration or defects, the kinds of things that would be happening that could kind of indicate that there's a demolition by neglect situation potentially happening. And I won't read all of those off to you, and they're actually listed in the ordinance. Okay, so how do we know that demolition by neglect is happening? So there's a baseline, and that baseline are these building surveys that kind of helped us identify these contributing structures. The city has a right to inquire as to the condition of these contributing structures on an annual basis. So we kind of have a baseline from which we can start to determine if demolition by neglect is happening. So how does this process work as defined in this draft ordinance? Well, first of all, and I'll ask Sam to bring up that slide. Oh, she's got it up here. So here's kind of a flow chart for you to follow. So a petition needs to be filed by an interested party, and an interested party can be any citizen of Cheyenne. It can be the board itself, our Historic Preservation Board. It could even be a city employee. So there has to be a petition that's filed to kind of make this ordinance go into effect. In addition, any local or state business entity, association, or a historic preservation entity can write to the board to request that it investigates whether there's an incidence of demolition by neglect happening. The petition has to cite the specific defects, and you had kind of a sample of what some of those defects are. So the petition has to enumerate what those structural defects are, and only one petition can be filed per year on the same property. So another important piece is a notification of the property owner. I'll give you some more details about this shortly. Next section, or the next step, is review by the director of the Planning and Development Department. So the petition is received by the planning director, who then submits it to the Cheyenne Historic Preservation Board for its review. And that will come up at discussion at a scheduled Cheyenne Historic Preservation Board meeting. According to the ordinance, the board then has 45 days to conduct an investigation and establish whether or not there is a finding for demolition by neglect. And in terms of determinations, if there is a determination that yes, we think there's demolition by neglect happening here, the property owner will be notified and then has 180 days to comply. So if a motion is passed determining a finding, a complaint is then issued to the property owner. And in the ordinance, it has to be filed within 14 days of that determination. The ordinance describes the specific process for notifying the property owner. So we'll go back to that portion of this process. So a complaint is issued in writing that includes a copy of the ordinance, copy of the petition, and a communication of the property owner's right to an appeal hearing, an offer to meet with the planning director or their designee, and a listing of all applicable deadlines, including the 30 days to comply by commencing repair work, and 180 days to complete those repairs. And there's an opportunity to actually extend that at the owner's request. The owner can request a 90-day extension, and this notification to the property owner also has to let them know that there is a right to file an appeal with the Board of Adjustment within 10 days. So that's kind of the due process components of informing the property owner of their rights under this ordinance. And it's also a requirement in the ordinance that the complaint is sent by first-class mail and posted on the property or personal service. It's considered effective if there's no return of post within 15 days. Sometimes you have a situation where it's difficult to locate a property owner. So if the owner's whereabouts are unknown, the ordinance requires posting in a generally circulated local publication like our Cheyenne Tribune Eagle. Has to be published once a week for 2 weeks. And that kind of satisfies the process of making sure the owner has been notified. This process can be suspended if the owner shows initiative and works out an agreement with the planning director or the planning director's designee to make repairs within a negotiated time frame. Then this whole process can be suspended. And then in terms of the appeals process, what happens there is it goes to the appropriate city entity, which in our case in Cheyenne is the Board of Adjustment. And the owner may request in writing a right to a hearing before the Board of Adjustment, no less than 30 and no more than 45 days after the complaint is served. So there's kind of an identified period of time that the owner is given. The hearing gives the owner the opportunity to dispute the charge and also to do something that is unique to these demolition by neglect ordinances around the country, and that is to make a claim of undue economic hardship. And I'll get to a little bit more on that in just a minute. As with any ordinance, there is a provision for the enforcement kind of side of it. So the ordinance calls for any one or more of the following remedies. So one of the enforcement provisions is an order for compliance. And that means that the city can apply to have the court issue an order for repairs to be done to bring the building within compliance. Another enforcement option is civil penalties. Those penalties can be assessed under the penalty guidelines for zoning code violations, and those are subject to Board of Adjustment appeal. And then there's also alternative enforcement that can be considered if there's a determination of intentional violation or gross negligence. Then there can be an enforcement where no permit for new construction or land use alteration will be issued for 5 years. And that's in current City Code Title 15. And then there's another provision where if the owner refuses or fails to comply, the city can actually do the repair and maintenance work and bill the owner for that work. And the expenses are assessed as basically a lien on the property. And the lien is then released when the expenses have been reimbursed to the city by the property owner. So I'll go back to this other recourse that an owner has, and CJ mentioned it, and it's a finding of undue economic hardship. And here's how that works in this draft ordinance. So the owner can make a claim of economic hardship and be granted a hearing before the Historic Preservation Board. And they can do that without filing an appeal to the Board of Adjustment. They can go directly to the board and say, I think I'm in a condition of economic hardship. So they have to file within 15 days of the complaint. And then the board is compelled to have a hearing on that claim of economic hardship within 30 days. So the ordinance outlines what the burden of proof is that the owner has to meet in terms of economic hardship, and then it has 30 days to make a determination. So if the board listens to this claim and finds that there is no finding of undue economic hardship, then there's a final notice of the duty to repair the property, and that is given to the property owner. If there's a finding that, yes, there's a situation of undue economic hardship, the ordinance calls for a plan to relieve the hardship. And so the planning director or the designee can determine a time period for repairs or corrections of defects and take that kind of plan into action and basically provide some time and a plan for that economic hardship to be alleviated. So those are kind of in a nutshell, the components of this ordinance, what it is, what it would do, who it would apply to, what kinds of buildings, and how it would work. And I can also give you a little bit more background on how we put this together. We had a subcommittee of the board, and the board looked at kind of the basic ingredients of these kinds of ordinances. And we looked at the National Trust's guidance, and we made sure that this draft kind of had those basic components. And we made sure that there was an appeal process, that there was an undue economic hardship provision, and tried to make sure that those kinds of basic ingredients were present. And we looked at other sample ordinances from around the country, including some kind of in our region, and put this proposal together. And so there's kind of your nuts and bolts. And I think we can turn it back over to Jason for questions.
Thank you, Millward. So as the next step said, we want to make sure that this ordinance is as good as it can be. And we want to hear from the public and from City Council. So at this time, we'll go ahead and open it up for any comments or questions or concerns, anything that any of you might have. Anybody at all?
Jason, this is Amber.
Amber, hi.
So I just have some questions when it comes to making the repairs. And I guess just to take a minute to talk about some things I've encountered through the facade improvement program and the capital improvement program. You know, one of the challenges that I see is the desire for strict preservation, which means that the elements when the repairs are done are historically accurate and restore the building back to as close to its original condition as we can get, you know, given the change in time and materials and availability, versus functional preservation, which really addresses things like window replacements, those sorts of things, maintaining the property, but isn't necessarily historically accurate. Windows are a really good example of this, the use of aluminum windows versus wood pane windows. You know, the costs tend to be significantly higher for strict preservation. And a lot of times what'll happen is that when you try to push strict preservation, people will elect not to do it because it's so much more expensive, which then just continues to compound the problems that we see downtown and many that you've described here today. And so, you know, it wasn't clear from the presentation, when those repairs are conducted, are we focused on functional preservation or are we focused on strict preservation? And if so, what is the plan to address the additional costs that the property owner is going to incur in order to bring it back up to strict preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office or CHIPO's standards?
I can take a try at that if you'd like, Mr. Chair.
Go for it.
Yeah, so thank you for that great question. So strictly speaking, in the ordinance as drafted, there is not a provision that compels the strict kind of historic preservation. It does kind of call for the repair and maintenance part of it, but it doesn't require it to be strict preservation like historically accurate windows, so to speak. But I think the balancing act there is that there's kind of a threshold, I guess, beyond which you've changed the original integrity and style and setting of the building to the point that would no longer qualify to be on the listed on the National Register. But I think for the most part, the kinds of structural issues and things of that nature can be repaired in a way that is functional and doesn't require some kind of a strict historic preservation process. There are, and I don't know if SHPO still has these, but there are some funding recourses for this kind of stuff, historic preservation tax credits and other kind of options that help make it more affordable for the property owner. But yeah, the ordinance does not mandate that it be under guidelines for strict preservation.
And along those lines, there are, I guess, some nuances involved as well. So if the house or the building may be considered contributing for features that aren't necessarily in disrepair, but if you have like a modern window that is broken and it's letting water into the building and it's possibly deteriorating something that is historic and important to the building, then it's just a matter of repairing what may already be in a window that's not original to the building. So there's a little bit of those nuances as well that can be managed on a case-by-case basis.
I'd like to point out that Stephanie Lowe put a question in the chat. She wants to know how City Council feels about the ordinance and overall, are they supportive?
Well, she's putting us in the perilous spot of interpreting the subjective opinions of the City Council, and I hesitate to do that. But we've gotten some great questions from members of the council, and my personal opinion is that because they've out and out told us that they are supportive. I've heard a lot of supportive comments from them and some very thoughtful questions and concerns.
I've got some concerns about some of these things. You know, we're looking at some buildings that are 100 years old that have foundations that are stone, and we're expected to bring them up to modern day standards or maintain them when we're tearing down and replacing buildings that are 20 years old. I think sometimes our board gets a little overzealous on these 1,300 buildings that are out there that the city owns 2 of. And they're expecting a whole lot more from landowners that just aren't feasibly economically there. And I think that their desire to push their agenda sometimes puts us into a position where a building doesn't get tore down that needs to be tore down. And so then it gets boarded up and just sits idly by because the preservation board, for whatever reason, deemed that it wasn't worth coming down.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Flynn. I think in those instances there is the provision for economic hardship. I mean, what are your thoughts on that particular remedy avenue for landowners?
I just think that in some circumstances, we are beating a dead horse and all we're going to do is run up legal expenses between the city and some owners some places. You have a piece of my property on your little photo slide there of 1721 Evans. There on the corner, we went to the preservation board. It's got rock basement or rock foundations, it's leaking. We brought in engineers, they testified at the board, but for whatever reason, the board felt that it couldn't be torn down, but yet it's uninhabitable. So it's been boarded up and now it's sitting there, and it's been 2 or 3 years now. And I'm feeling a little nervous about this because I'm concerned that I'm going to be one of these targets. And you know, it's 100-year-old building that's been just, it's wore out. It's wore out. That's what happens to a lot of these buildings. And there's just some concerns that are out there. I'm also concerned with the fact that one person, you know, makes these filing of a complaint. Is that person going to be notified, or are they going to be hidden behind the preservation board? And is this just going to be a yearly thing for some things? I just don't like the direction that some of this is going. I think the preservation board creates some of their own problems. There's no funding out there for the historic district. There's no grant money. When the city goes in and does it, the state goes in and does it, they're using taxpayer money, and they're using huge amounts of it. It's not as easy as it sounds.
Thank you.
Uh,
Oh, sorry.
After you respond to this question, Councilman Laybourne has his hand up. So
Oh,
you can
okay. Okay.
address him next.
Sure. And I guess along those lines, Mr. Flynn, this doesn't trump the existing regulations for overall demolishing the structure. This is more of a way to hopefully stave off demolition of those structures. I don't know. Millward, did you have a point to make on the process?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you were according to this ordinance, if you're an owner of one of these contributing structures, there's no way around what this ordinance does. It does kind of create a duty to keep it maintained and keep it in good repair. And if it's a situation where, you know, it's fallen into disrepair and maybe it's even a public safety hazard because the owner is just neglecting, you know, their duty, then there's a provision in this for economic hardship. If there's a financial problem or something, that this gives kind of a recourse. And so I think there are some provisions that might help, but the purpose of an ordinance like this is to try to help preserve the historic character of a city that prides itself on its history and actually relies for a lot of its economic impact on promoting and selling its history through its CVB and its tourism efforts. It's a big reason we got dollars coming into this community every year, is because we sell Cheyenne as a great destination to visit because of its history. And here's a way to actually have that history there for people when they come and see it. It's part of what we value in the city and what we depend on economically. And those are I think some other components to the reason that we would want to do something like this in the first place.
Mr. Chair, I'd also just add that, you know, Mr. Flynn, I think your concerns are understandable. And I will say that as we developed it through this process, you know, we really looked at, does this target anybody? Does it pick on anybody? And we felt the answer is no. There's no one specifically that we're saying that we would want to see this used with. We, in fact, didn't have a single building that we think is going to get reported or someone's going to make an issue about right away. It's more just adding, I think, another layer into our toolbox so that we can preserve those historic structures. And I think something that an emphasis I want to make at 2 quick points. One is it's definitely not expecting the building to be in immaculate shape. It's not expecting, I know people have rental properties. I know, you know, it's expensive. My folks own a lot of properties in my hometown, and it can be very expensive and burdensome to maintain those properties. But I think where this is really going is to just keep the location from falling apart, not necessarily to keep it in perfect condition. It's more of a preventative measure from having to get to the point where it does get torn down. And in response to, you know, your concern about being able to know who's making that comment, I don't think anything in there is going to make it, nothing's going to make it secretive. And, you know, we're incorporated the layer of meeting with the board and then still having the board of adjustment so that anybody that this would affect has due process protections. So they get a multiple layer of review to say, hey, I disagree with the board or I disagree with that. And there's multiple people that can look at it along the way.
And our board and other boards in the city are required to keep minutes from our meetings. They're also public meetings, so that all that information is part of the public record. Thank you, CJ. Councilman Laybourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you'll bear with me for a bit here because this is something that is very important to me personally. I live in a home in the Lakeview Historic District and own one of the oldest properties downtown at 18th and Warren. And I've been involved in issues of this nature for many, many years, including demolition by neglect issues at the hospital, very close to my home, going back quite a ways, as well as having been a property manager for many years and having dealt with a lot of problem properties in a variety of ways. So, and I also want to say, as a native, I watched way too many important buildings go. And I'm glad that we've changed our attitude. And I'm glad that this board is a more active board. Obviously, a very active board to be bringing this resolution before us. So I would say that, in my opinion, this is the best board we've ever had. And certainly some of the issues that we saw in the initial presentation are very serious issues of the Gary block and the property that was saved from demolition at 18th and Evans that we saw in that picture. That was a dramatic event with the track hoe right there. And luckily we were able to use that demolition permit issue to keep that building. And I hope that it's going to change hands. There's some adjacent property there that is owned by the same people. And so I think that very, very important. However, I do have some serious concerns about this, and they are not, they're not in any way a denial that we have issues, but they are very much concerns of the not only how this is going to play out in the near future when it's brought before the council, but its long-term effect in the city. And I think that we really have I have some very serious concerns here that begin with the purpose and authority general and item C in that, which ends up, we covered the cost of such corrective action from the owner after repairs are made. So I hope that Sam Cowley can bring up the slide or the picture that I gave to her for your consideration. This is a contributing structure at 609 Paprikan in the South Cheyenne Historic District. It is has been a big problem. I've been working on it for quite a while. It was a case where the property owner evidently died. Some people that I believe had no business in there were living in there without the sanitary service of the sewer and water. And you can see it's cleaned up in the front of the building now, but it is not, at the time it was just, they threw all their trash out in the front yard. It was very, very disturbing to the neighbors, and they brought it to my attention, and I worked on it for several months to get it to this point. And I wonder if, Sam, if you can move to the next slide, which has the order on it. There is a order, there it is. So what we have now is finally, after some pretty serious effort, this property was basically determined that could not have anyone live in it, and that its structural issues were so serious that there needs to be some determination. And so it's a small house, but it is listed as a contributing structure. And it is now, thankfully, finally had the windows covered with plywood and screwed on good so that no one can get back in there and live there any longer. Unfortunately, this is not a unique situation. I think this is an extreme situation, but it definitely is one that would apply to this ordinance, in my opinion. And then when you get to this point, I think we need to understand that that notification process of a deceased owner that doesn't live in Cheyenne, doesn't read the Cheyenne paper, and just obviously, frankly, doesn't care, it is a difficult process. So I would urge you to go by 609 Paprikan and see for yourself what that situation is and how this ordinance might affect it, because the worst of the problem has been taken care of in that no squatters can continue to occupy the building. But what happens next is a very interesting question, and that leads to the question of the lien. We had a couple of properties here by the municipal building on Bent, right across the street from our new Civic Center Plaza, and next to the very expensive brand new Warehouse 21 building. And they were being used for some very, very bad purposes. So thanks to our attorney's office, we did get them demolished. Now, the question of the lien is an interesting one, and I'm not holding myself up as an attorney here, but in this particular case of this other property that I'm referring to on Bent Avenue, which isn't in a historic district, but nevertheless raises the question of the lien. Sometimes these properties are entangled in all sorts of legal mortgage type or ownership type or family, multiple descendants who don't get along. I mean, there are a lot of issues there. It isn't as easy as establishing the lien and collecting the money. And in fact, I believe that is there anyone here, is Alessandra Fakelman from the city attorney's office on this call?
I don't think so.
I don't believe so, Mr. Laybourne.
Well, she is in the process of working on that very issue, because to really be able to deal with these problems like that one I just pointed to at 609 Paprikan, we're going to have to be able to recoup at least some of the expenditures of the city if we leveled the building, and that building is way beyond repair, and then sold the lot. But we would have to be the primary lien holder, not the bank, not anyone else. And that's a question that we're working on right now, and I hope that we can deal with it in the near future. So that is a concern of mine, and I am particularly concerned if the board really wants to do what is suggested here, which is the means testing of the property owners and their economic hardship. And I can assure you that people get real touchy about their financial condition and the city's interest in their financial condition. And I really wonder if the board understands what they're getting into here, because that is a question of economic hardship is a tough question. And I would hate to be asking what is generally known as a slumlord to be fixing their property and actually enforcing it and seeking justification from that individual for that action. I think that that's a very, very challenging question, and one that I'm concerned about a volunteer board acting on. That is certainly worthy of consideration if that's really what you want to do. And then we go to loans and grants from the city, the county, or other public, private, or nonprofit sources to help here. And I can assure you that right now in the city of Cheyenne and in the foreseeable future, we have absolutely no money to devote to this purpose. And I think that you should be really clear about that. And so you get into further in that section, the question of repairs, which would see the value as appraised for property tax purposes and the land on which it's located. That's quite a discussion you're going to have that might be more complex than you anticipate. Further on in the remedies and penalties, there's the order for compliance. The city can apply for and the court may issue an order. And I'm kind of curious about this language. I'll be taking it up with the city attorney's office. The use of that term court. Perhaps they're referring to the Board of Adjustment after the appeal is made and the Board of Adjustment makes some sort of ruling, but maybe that's interpreted as a court. But I don't think that the Historic Preservation Board is a court, and it continues whenever the party is cited for contempt by the court. So that's a question that I'm certainly interested in and hope to understand better. So that then we get to enforcement alternatives. Number 4, expenditures for repair work. The city may elect to pay for the repair work and charge the owner of such qualifying building for the expenses incurred. That's having a background in property management and construction. You can talk about some real serious expenses here, particularly when you get into some of these properties that have been neglected. When you begin the work, you often find that there's more to it. And where do you stop? And who makes that determination? So again, I applaud the board for the effort. I recognize that we have a very serious problem here. And it certainly isn't limited to the historic districts. I believe in historic districts, and I've been participated in approval of historic districts and know that we have, as a community, a shameful history of destruction that probably shouldn't have happened. But realistically, I can tell you I can't support this ordinance until some changes and explanations are made. And I can't speak for anyone else. I haven't really discussed it in detail with them. And I think it's very prudent to do more of a discussion with the members of the council one-on-one, or however you want to do it, because these Zoom meetings, and particularly this Zoom meeting at 5:30 on Friday, might not be the best time to be doing that. And I foresee some real serious issues here. I totally believe that property rights come with property responsibilities, and that it is critical that we maintain our neighborhoods and do what we can to see that they are kept up and kept livable. But at this point, I'm sorry to say that until some changes are made here and some better understandings are achieved, which I believe can probably happen, I would really like to see a workable, effective ordinance, and it's not uncommon for an ordinance of a very specific and important nature to go through quite a process before it finally becomes law. And I think that's the case that we need to be following here. So I hope that makes my position clear. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Or if you would care to discuss it with me at any time later on, I'm available. This is something that I would have to say that I believe that the current board and the efforts that they're making is a reflection of the community at large that has a real deep desire to see better architectural historic preservation in our city. My question is this really the proper way exactly to do it and to avoid and work through some of these issues? Because we're living in a very, I find, a challenging time in our society where there are a number of people, and I'm sure there are a number of people in some of these historic districts who have contempt for government, for city government, and do not want to be, I'm of course get complaints about all kinds of things. And it is imperative that we do our best to look at these issues and resolve them before we bring them to the council, possibly pass this into law, and then have some serious problems. So thank you. And I'd be glad to answer any questions now or at your convenience.
Thank you, Councilman, for your comments. I guess so. For the recording and those that may be watching now or after, we do want this to be as robust and effective of an ordinance as possible. And so over the past few months, we have been meeting with small groups of councilmen and trying to get your all's comments addressed as best we can. And maybe we need to sit down with you on one-on-one on some of your specific comments. But I mean, I guess nothing is perfect, and I think 609 Paprikan is certainly an extreme example. It may or may not be the only example in town, I don't know, but it certainly is an extreme example. And I mean, if you have any ideas for how you would like to change or reword things, I mean, certainly we can do that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but none of this also trumps other remedies available to the city per Wyoming statutes, such as eminent domain or condemnation under the unsafe buildings code. Maybe we need to tie those two together more. I don't know. I don't know if you had any specific suggestions for improvement, or if we should just sit down with you and Alessandra and go page by page through it and try to work through issues.
I'd love to sit down with Alessandra and go through page by page, but I want to emphasize this. It is the elected officials, like myself, that will have to justify and explain this process. And I foresee that at the moment, we're not having very much public comment here, but I'd be very, very surprised if we didn't have quite a bit. And I think it's very important that we have time, and certainly this is the very challenging time with the Zoom meeting and the COVID, that it's unusual. But I don't believe that bringing this ordinance forward on the 22nd of this month is a good idea. And I'm certainly glad to go over this and explain it and try to really bring in some of the people who work on these issues from the building department and nuisance that have a lot of experience at this. And I'd like to hear what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to add a couple thoughts if I could.
Go ahead.
First off, Councilman Laybourne, thank you for your thoughts on that. I think you brought up some really good detailed points. I could tell you did your homework and went through it very carefully. I do think there's some areas where, for example, you mentioned the court. I think there's some definitions we could add into the ordinance that will help define those things better. That's something I know I had spoken to Chairman Bogsty about before, that maybe there were some areas we could beef up definitions to make that a little more clear for individuals that are reading it. So I think that's a place we could go. It also, I think, in the terms of, I know when we had a meeting with council on this, there were some concerns from various members of council about the costs incurred with it. And I would, propose that maybe in the end, this might save us some money, that that avoiding something like the carry again, where the city had to get involved and help take care of that property. In the long term, this might be able to save the city some money if we actually use this mechanism to enforce. And I believe that when they were, I'm going to have to defer to my colleagues on this, but when it was being developed, a lot of these concepts and principles from this ordinance were essentially brought in from what other communities have done and have found successful in their ordinances. So I think that certainly there's probably room for improvement, but I think a lot of it is stuff we tried to focus on that we've seen has been successful for communities that have nice historic districts.
Thank you, CJ.
It looks like Kathy has her hand up if someone wants to address her question when you're done with this one.
Sure.
Well, I was just going to provide some assurances to Councilman Laybourne that we've been working on this for a long time. And I think I speak on behalf of everybody on your volunteer board that we know what we're kind of getting ourselves into, and we're committed to our role in making sure that this is a well-run, efficient process, because we're committed to what it does for the city and for historic preservation. And you've got a lot of really good, smart, passionate people on this board who have a lot of experience in the business and in the world. And I'm very confident myself in the abilities of the board to enact their duties under this ordinance.
Thank you, Millward. Kathy.
Hello, Councilman Laybourne. I wanted to address some of your comments. I understand the city's position, or the city's position that they might take, that this could be very costly. My thought in the ordinance as a member of the board is that this could be a way that you don't have those huge costs. This could be a way to where we could address them prior to the property, like on Paprikan, that gets to that extreme. We want to make sure they don't get to that extreme to where the city has to come in and do that. Unfortunately, there is the downside that it might happen. We are hoping to deter that so it does not become the cost of the city. We would always take comments from the councilmen. We would love to sit down and revamp the ordinance to make it work for everyone, but we definitely want to preserve our history in Cheyenne and make it the value that we all believe in.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, let's work on getting a meeting then scheduled with Councilman Laybourne and folks from the building department, planning department, nuisance, and the city attorney's office, and let's sit down and hash out some of these issues then. Let's make it a good ordinance. Okay. Are there Don? Yes.
Yeah, this is Don Harold, a member of the board. I since I've been on the board, one of the first comments I always get is, well, the city does a terrible job at preserving historic properties. And I think this is a tool, or can be an effective tool, so we can carry out our mission. It's, looking at the Cary building, it's hard to say, how that could have been prevented without some kind of, like I say, tools to get it accomplished. I think we need the ordinance is necessary, and the technical issues have to be worked out, but to do without the ordinance again, I think we'll find ourselves in the same situation where the property is degraded and becomes a responsibility of the city to take over, and we need the tools to carry out our mission.
Thank you, Don. Yes, I think using the Cary building as an example, if something like this ordinance were in place at the time, somebody could have invoked the ordinance and somebody would have seen the holes in the roof. The roof could have been fixed and water and pigeons wouldn't have gotten into that building, and it would still would still exist today. Oh, sorry, CJ.
No, please go ahead. I was just
okay.
Sure.
And that building would still exist today, and it wouldn't have been, as CJ had pointed out, such an expense on the city. It wouldn't have had to have been purchased and torn down and mitigated, and that's really the goal of this ordinance, like Kathy had said, also to prevent things from getting to that point where the only option at that point is to tear it down. CJ, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I think we all, I don't necessarily think there's properties there yet, but I think we all could imagine the next Cary building. I think, for example, the Heinz building or some of the others that, could start to get into that endangered area. And, if they were gone, they leave such a hole in our community. They leave such a scar on that location that I think you can never really fix. And I think, luckily we have many landowners, frankly, like yourself, Councilman Laybourne, who take good care of properties. And I think, that should be something we want to press and emulate of how do we get folks to want to make these buildings successful. Because again, going back to being a business owner, I currently rent my building. I'm lucky to have a landlord that takes very good care of it. And I want to be in a building that's beautiful, and I think other people do too. And I think we've got some great landlords, but if we can encourage all of them to kind of keep their buildings beautiful and keep them habitable, then I think hopefully that's going to be profitable and useful for those landlords as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, CJ.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Councilman.
Well, I was, of course, as a downtown property owner and a representative of this district, this ward, very involved and interested in the process at the Cary building over the years. And I'm not as convinced as the members of this board seem to be that would have been the tool that would have been that effective. That property owner lived in California. I met with them at the property. I was aware of some of those issues. Might have helped, but no guarantee. And when we're crafting a law of this magnitude, I just have had the experience of these issues for a long time. And I want to assure every member of the board that I want to see progress. And I want to see pride. And I believe that this board, with the efforts it did at the Warren Rest House and that are continuing, that I fully support at the Historic Fountain, is the most active and thoughtful board that I can remember. So don't get me wrong. I'm just giving you the benefit of my experience, because there are individuals who will not comply with this. And that puts us in the position of making them comply with it. And to do that, I think you need to understand the city's position and the interpretation of the International Property Management Code and how it applies here as it did at 609 Paprikan. So I brought that issue of 609 Paprikan to your attention for a reason. And the reason is, I don't believe if this ordinance was in effect, it could possibly have effect on that building that is anticipated. And so we just, it's just a difficult question, but I appreciate your time. I know that you're sincere and knowledgeable and believe in a lot of the same things I do. I look forward to our discussion on this as it continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Yeah, we are trying, doing our best here. Let's try and get a meeting scheduled with these folks in these departments that you brought up, and see where we can go from there. Does anybody else have any questions, comments, or concerns at this time? No? All right. Well, then I appreciate everybody's time tonight, and we will take these concerns and evaluate next steps and go from there. So thank
Appreciate
you.
everybody showing up tonight and taking your time on a Friday. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you for the thoughts, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Good night.